The pen isn't moving. That's the thing nobody tells you. A man sits at a vast mahogany desk inside the Kremlin, the most powerful office in 1/6 of the world's land surface, and the pen in his right hand simply hovers, nib down, cap off, poised above a stack of official documents, the red Soviet state seal visible on the topmost page. His knuckles are white around the barrel. His eyes are fixed on something that isn't in the room. Outside, Moscow is cold, December cold, the kind that turns breath into smoke and makes the cobblestones look like they've been carved from bone. Inside, the only sound is the tick of a clock on the wall behind him. He's been sitting like this for almost 4 minutes. The document beneath that hovering nib will, the moment it is signed, erase a nation of 293 million people from the map of the world. Not through war, not through invasion, through ink. Who is this man, and why is the pen still not moving? His name is Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. He is 60 years old. He is the 8th and final leader of the Soviet Union. And the port wine birthmark spreading across his forehead has been on the front page of every newspaper on Earth for 6 years. He came to power in March 1985, promising to save the system. He is about to sign the document that ends it. Here are the numbers that frame that pen hovering above that page. The Soviet Union, at its peak, controlled 22.4 million square kilometers, larger than the entire surface of the moon. It maintained 27,000 nuclear warheads. It had put the first human being in space. Its military consumed, by 1989, an estimated 25% of the entire national GDP. And Soviet economists knew that number was so damaging they kept it off the books, hidden from the very government they served for nearly a decade. And on December 25, 1991, at 7:32 p.m. Moscow time, it will simply stop existing. Not because an enemy defeated it, because it defeated itself. And that's just the beginning. Because the real question isn't how a superpower dissolves in 72 hours. The real question is, what took it so long to fall? And whether the warning signs were visible to anyone paying attention. Here's what this video is going to do. We're going to reconstruct those final 72 hours, December 23rd through December 26th, 1991, almost minute by minute. The phone calls, the meetings in rooms with no cameras, the moment a Soviet general watched a flag come down and didn't know what country he was standing in anymore. But we're also going to go back, because those 72 hours were the last visible seconds of a collapse that had been building for decades. They came from a decade of structural fractures that the system was architecturally incapable of admitting existed. The Afghan War, the oil price collapse of 1986, Chernobyl, a reform program that, by trying to save the Soviet state, handed its enemies a blueprint for dismantling it. And then, and this is the part that should keep you watching, we're going to look at what's happening right now, in 2024, to institutions that are showing the same patterns the Soviet Union showed in 1988. The same rigidity, the same gap between official numbers and real ones, the same inability to process bad news before bad news becomes catastrophe. The Soviet collapse wasn't a historical accident. It was a case study in what happens when a system mistakes its own size for its own strength. Stay with me, because the 72 hours start now. December 23rd, 1991, Monday morning. 2 days before Christmas, in a country that officially didn't celebrate Christmas, Gorbachev arrives at his Kremlin office at 9 a.m. He has, by this point, already lost. He just hasn't signed the paper yet. 3 days earlier, on December 21st, the leaders of 11 Soviet republics met in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, and signed a declaration forming the Commonwealth of Independent States. They did not invite Gorbachev. They did not call him. They faxed him the document. The president of the largest country in the world learned he had been dissolved via fax. But that fax didn't write itself. To understand how a superpower ends with a piece of paper and a signature, you have to go back. Much further back. By 1989, the Soviet economy wasn't struggling in the way that economies sometimes struggle and recover. It was bleeding out, and everyone in the room knew it. Oil had been the lifeblood of Soviet hard currency earnings since the 1970s. At its peak, oil and gas exports accounted for roughly 60% of Soviet foreign exchange revenue. Then, in 1986, Saudi Arabia flooded the global market. Oil prices collapsed from $30 a barrel to under $10 in less than 8 months. The Soviet budget didn't bend. It broke. The Kremlin responded the way it always responded to bad news. It classified the data. And then came Chernobyl. April 26, 1986. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explodes at 1:23 a.m. The initial Soviet response is to tell the world nothing happened. Local party officials report to Moscow that the situation is under control. It is not under control. 116,000 people will be permanently evacuated. The cleanup will cost, by some estimates, 18 billion rubles, in an economy already running on fumes. But the number that matters most isn't financial. It's psychological. Chernobyl proved to anyone watching that the Soviet system would lie about a nuclear explosion rather than admit a failure. Gorbachev understood this. That's what makes his story so strange and so tragic. He understood the system's pathology from inside it. When he launched glasnost, openness, in 1986, and perestroika, restructuring, shortly after, he wasn't being naive. He was performing emergency surgery on a patient who had been hiding symptoms for 40 years. The surgery worked. That was the problem. Once Soviet citizens could read uncensored newspapers, they read about the Gulag, about the famines, about the 1939 secret protocols that handed the Baltic states to Stalin. Once the republics could hold competitive elections, they elected nationalists. Once the economy could be discussed honestly, economists admitted it had been running a structural deficit since at least 1975. Glasnost didn't create the cracks. It just turned on the lights. By December 1st, 1991, Ukraine had held a referendum on independence. 92% voted yes. Not 52%, not 60%, 92%. Gorbachev had told the world that Ukrainians would never vote to leave. He was wrong by 92 percentage points. And now it's December 23rd. He's in his office. The phone on his desk rings. It's Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, the man who has been systematically dismantling Soviet authority for 18 months. Yeltsin tells Gorbachev he has until December 25th to vacate the presidential offices. Not a request, a deadline. December 24th, Tuesday. Gorbachev spends the day negotiating terms. Not terms of a peace settlement, terms of his own departure. He wants guarantees for his staff, his pension, confirmed in writing. He wants the nuclear briefcase, the chaget, the Soviet equivalent of the American football, transferred properly, with protocol, not just handed over in a hallway. He is, even now, trying to make the ending look like a transition rather than a collapse. He will not entirely succeed. The Soviet military is, at this moment, in a state that has no historical precedent. 27,000 nuclear warheads are distributed across 4 newly independent republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. There is no legal framework for who controls them. There is no treaty. There is no protocol. American diplomats are quietly terrified. James Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State, had spent much of 1991 flying between Moscow and the Republic capitals, trying to ensure that the dissolution of a nuclear superpower didn't produce 4 new nuclear states. He mostly succeeded, but mostly is a word that should make you uncomfortable when nuclear weapons are the subject. Now, here's where we return to the question from the opening. Remember that pen. Remember the man who couldn't quite bring himself to touch nib to page. The question wasn't just who he was. The question was, why wasn't the pen moving? And the partial answer is this. Gorbachev knew, with complete clarity, that signing that document meant he had failed. Not failed politically, failed at the thing he had spent his entire adult life trying to do, which was proof that the Soviet system could reform itself from within. He had believed, genuinely believed, that socialism with a human face was possible, that you could have the collective and the free press, the planned economy and the honest accounting, the union and the self-determining republics. He was wrong, and he knew it, and the pen hovered. And here's the thing. Blaming Gorbachev is easy, but it misses the point. His failure wasn't about the man. It was about the system he was handed and told to fix. And this is the part nobody talks about. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of bad leadership. It collapsed because it had spent 70 years building a system that could only function if everything went right. There was no institutional immune system, no mechanism for processing failure, admitting error, and adapting. When the oil price fell, the system couldn't say, "We got this wrong." When Chernobyl exploded, the system couldn't say, "Our safety culture is broken." When the republics demanded autonomy, the system couldn't say, "Let's renegotiate." Every single pressure that should have triggered adaptation instead triggered concealment. And concealment, compounded over decades, becomes a structural load-bearing wall made of paper. By 1991, the entire edifice was paper. December 25th, 7 p.m. Moscow time. Gorbachev sits in front of television cameras in his Kremlin office. He reads a resignation speech that is, by any measure, dignified. He says, "I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics." He says he leaves with concern, but also with hope. Then the cameras stop rolling. At 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag, the red banner with hammer and sickle, is lowered from the Kremlin's Senate Tower. The Russian tricolor goes up in its place. The ceremony takes 4 minutes. There is no crowd. There is no formal military honor guard. A handful of Kremlin workers watch from a courtyard below, their breath rising in the December cold. 74 years of Soviet rule ends in 4 minutes, in the dark, watched by maintenance staff. From ashes to insights. Because this is where the Soviet story stops being history and starts being a mirror. The Soviet Union looked, from the outside, like a fortress. It had the largest army on Earth. It had nuclear parity with the United States. Its GDP, by official Soviet statistics, was the second largest in the world. Western analysts, as late as 1990, were publishing papers arguing that the Soviet system was fundamentally stable. They were wrong, because they were reading the official numbers. In 2024, the International Monetary Fund published its annual assessment of global institutional fragility. The metrics they use, debt to GDP ratios hidden through off-balance sheet accounting, state enterprises reporting profits they don't have, demographic data that doesn't match birth and death registries, these are not abstract concerns. Right now, at least 6 G20 economies are carrying what the IMF calls hidden fiscal stress, structural deficits that don't appear in headline numbers because they've been reclassified, deferred, or simply not counted. That's not an accusation. That's a methodology. China's property sector debt, as of 2023, is estimated at somewhere between $7 trillion and $12 trillion, depending on which accounting framework you use and whether you include local government financing vehicles that are technically off the books. The range between those two numbers, $5 trillion, is larger than the entire GDP of Japan. The uncertainty itself is the problem. The Soviet Union also had a range. Its economists knew the real defense spending figure was somewhere between 15% and 25% of GDP. They just couldn't admit which end of the range was true. And it's not only authoritarian systems. In 2023, the U.S. Congressional Budget Office projected that mandatory federal spending will exceed total federal revenue by 2033. Not the deficit, the mandatory spending alone. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the discretionary budget, defense, infrastructure, everything else, would have to be funded entirely by borrowing. This is not a political point. It is an arithmetic point. And the institutional response, so far, has been to extend the projection window and change the accounting baseline. which is, structurally, exactly what Soviet planners did in 1975. What the Soviet collapse actually teaches us isn't that big systems always fall apart. Plenty of them don't. It's that large systems collapse suddenly, after appearing stable for a very long time, when the gap between their official story and their operational reality becomes too wide to paper over. The collapse doesn't announce itself. It arrives as a fact. Learn from the past to shape the future. And the past is saying, very clearly, the institutions most at risk are the ones most confident they are not at risk. The pen that hovered over that resignation document wasn't hesitating out of cowardice. It was hesitating because the man holding it had spent 6 years trying to close a gap that had been growing for 40. And he was only now understanding that some gaps, once they reach a certain width, cannot be closed from inside the system that created them. The flag came down in 4 minutes. The pen finally touched the page. And here's the thing that the cameras didn't capture, the thing that took years to understand. The Soviet Union didn't die on December 25, 1991. It died the first time a Soviet official looked at a true number and wrote down a different one, and got promoted for it. The flag coming down is never the moment it ends. By the time the flag comes down, it's been over for years. You're just watching the world catch up to a fact that the ledgers already knew. If this video raised one question you can't shake, it's probably this one. Gorbachev tried to reform a system from within, and the reform itself triggered the collapse. So, is internal reform ever actually possible? Or does every attempt to fix a broken system from inside it simply accelerate the breaking? That question has an answer, and it comes from a collapse that happened 1,500 years earlier, in a city that was also supposed to be eternal. That video is next.